Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Egypt. I'm Hanna. The man widely expected to win Egypt's next presidential election says his countrymen will need to tighten their belts, but that economic growth is on its way. Egyptians will decide whether they want Abdul El-Sisi as president on May the 26th. And over the past few weeks, Sisi has been laying out a plan on how he would deal with Egypt's problems. After years of political turmoil, the economy is in trouble. Huge government subsidies are no longer sustainable, the budget deficit is dangerously high, and unemployment threatens to bring Egyptians back onto the streets. But Sisi says Egyptians will see change in the next 2 years. And when it happens, the former general says, the pace of progress will be unprecedented. Well, Sisi hasn't released a manifesto, but he's let voters hear his plans for the economy in a series of interviews. And he's called for a greater role for the state in planning and managing the economy, and set out a grand scheme to populate the desert by providing infrastructure to areas away from the Nile Delta, where the vast number of Egyptians live. Sisi says he'll remove crippling government subsidies gradually because Egyptians wouldn't tolerate it without first seeing higher incomes. And when asked how he would fund his policies, he talked about yet more investment and aid from Gulf and Arab countries. Well, by contrast, Egypt's other presidential contender, Hamdin Sabahi, has released an 81-page manifesto. In it, he promises to restructure the public sector and has promised to protect government subsidies and government-owned companies. He says he'll focus on helping small and medium-sized businesses, and as part of that plan, provide sources of microfinance and land to people trying to set up new companies. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. In Oxford, Angus Blair, president of the Signet Institute, an economist and specialist on the business and politics of the Middle East and North Africa region. And joining us here in Doha, Dr. Tawfik Hamid, senior fellow and chair for study of Islamic Radicalism at the Potamac Institute for Policy Studies. And Dr. Mawgoud Dardery, former member of the Egyptian Parliament. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
But to begin, as we mentioned earlier, Egypt's elections are due to be held on May the 26th. But expatriates have already begun voting outside the country. Egyptians in over 140 countries started casting their ballots on Thursday, and the turnout has been high in New York. Some 65,000 are expected to vote for a new president. To begin with you, Tawfik Hamid, how much of a role is the economy going to play in this presidential election?
I believe it's pivotal. If you still remember, Mike, the early chants in Tahrir Square, it was عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, which translates to bread, freedom and social justice. So bread was number one, was the first. And I still believe this is still number one and the first priority of most of the Egyptians. This does not say that other factors do not play a role. Like, for example, some people want freedoms, some people want more security and stability. But at the end, at the core of the problem, the economy plays the most pivotal role, I believe so.
Angus Blair, your view on that? How big a role will the economy play, do you believe, in the voting?
I agree, it's a very important issue when you put it in the background of the fact that Egyptian economic growth is running only at just over 1% per annum. Inflation's running at over 10% per annum. Food price inflation probably higher. There's a very low job creation. And on a fiscal position, the government's in a bad way. So from everywhere you look at it, from the people that I see all over Egypt and the expats, it's a very important part of whatever they view in terms of the future of Egypt is how is the economy and what's happening. And so far, I have to say the programs are quite light. And the decisions that people making are, I think, will be based on the policies of whoever will be president, what they will say and do very quickly about the economy.
Well, Abdul Mawgoud Dardery, your view, how important do you think it is? Do you agree with our other guests?
Thank you very much for having me. I do agree that economy plays a major role, but I disagree calling what's happening in Egypt an election. It is not election because the democratically elected president who was kidnapped by the military general, now the military general is trying to become the president. That is not an election. There is no freedom in the country. There is no freedom of press, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly. We cannot really call this fair and free election. You can call it a referendum, you can call it a takeover, you can call it anything we like, but let us not confuse the word election with what's happening in Egypt. There is no doubt the economy is very important. It plays a major role, and the military will never bring economic reform because the military is very oppressive and does not like to liberalize the economy because it goes against the economic interests of the military. That's why the future is very gloomy for the people of Egypt because of the military dictatorship. And what we're having now is a police state similar to that of Mubarak days, in fact worse than Mubarak days.
Well, Angus Blair, your view on that, do you think that the fact that one of these candidates is a former general or very recently a general, do you think that's going to impact on whatever policy may emerge during the election and after?
Well, your previous guest made a very slanted political view, but it's his view on where he's coming from. From my perspective, I'm looking at the facts, looking at what is happening on the ground in terms of the economy and business. And I have to say, every indication that we have is that both candidates are standing, know that the economy is in a very difficult position and there needs to be a better focus. Although I have to say, the programme that we've seen of Mr. Hamdeen Sabahi so far is basically to give away land and other issues. It's an old-fashioned form of economic policy and quite frankly won't work in a new Egypt. We can see that under Field Marshal El-Sisi, his programme at least that we can see so far, but there's not much to go on, but we are aware of the people around him giving advice, and it's quite clear they know that what the key structural economic problems of Egypt are, and that they're looking to find ways to boost the economy as quickly as possible. And part of that is I think we've seen under the relatively recent appointment of Prime Minister Ibrahim Matlab, and the appointment of, I have to say, a very good finance minister in Hanna Dimian, who's been in the finance ministry for years and was pushed out by the Muslim Brotherhood. He has got a real focus on what Egypt needs to do, and I think that you need people of competence and a vision to be able to push the economy forward. And I think that assuming the elections proceed smoothly, for the presidential elections, the first week of June, we'll see that programme come out pretty quickly because it's necessary. People have to get back to work, and we have to find other ways to answer the structural problems that Egypt faces.
Well, Tawfik, I mean, I want to pick up on something that Abdul brought into the discussion, which Angus Blair described as slanted political view. But is it possible to actually draw out the political context, to remove it from the election itself and indeed from the economy, knowing the background to all of this? Is it possible to separate it out and see at the economy in isolation?
I am sure you can separate completely the political things because economy at the end are numbers, but politics play some role because when you have major conflict within politics, when you have two opposing powers, each one wants to move the country in a different direction, then the political situation can result in some local instability, which can ultimately affect the economy. So you really can separate in theory, but in reality, the political situation there need to be solved some way or another to bring economic progress. So, yeah.
Abdul Dardery, I mean, your view on that, the separating out of the economy, looking at the facts and the figures of an economic situation, is it possible, do you believe, to remove it from the political nexus, from the political background?
I believe it is impossible to remove the political from the economic. The reason why we Egyptians went to the streets on January 25th is because of the political problem. We wanted economic reform, we wanted freedom, social justice, and human dignity. It is very difficult. The political, what is political and what's economic, almost the same, the two faces of the same coin. And Egyptians want economic reform. Under the military rule, there can't be economic reform because there is no political reform. When there is no transparency, your guest from England is talking about competency. You cannot have competent or efficient economic reform because of there is no freedom. When people are not free to discuss whatever economic policies. Look at, for example, the budget of the military is not open for discussion even by the Egyptian parliament. Look at, there is about 50% poverty, under poverty line or under near poverty line. With such a situation in Egypt, you cannot have with the police state, when more than 5,000 people got killed in the past 10 months, more than 23,000 people are in jail now. You cannot expect economic reform to happen from such a dictatorial regime.
But well, Angus Blair, perhaps we can agree to differ on this particular issue, but that question of instability that has been brought up repeatedly, instability that plays no doubt into the economic development or attempts to develop an economy, does it not?
Well, it's interesting. Let's put it in context. Egypt has been in a longer-term revolution since January 2011. Only one quarter in the period since then have you seen a dip in the economy. The economy has grown at positive levels. That would almost be impossible in any other country, and I think it shows some structural strengths in Egypt that aren't really talked about very much. Very large informal economy, very large remittances, enormous liquidity, and very low household debt, very low private sector debt, much lower than many other European states, for example. That liquidity helps maintain a relatively strong economy, albeit it's only about 1%. In other countries, growth would have fallen. You'd have had a fall in a major recession. And I think that when you actually put that in context, anyone who comes in with a real program would see growth. Now, if you want to answer your guest in Doha, under the Muslim Brotherhood government, the economy continued to go in a rapid tailspin very quickly because of incompetent decisions under incompetent people. And the foreign exchange reserves are falling, domestic investment was falling, foreign direct investment was falling. In the last few months, there's been significant investment from a number of global companies, amongst them Coca-Cola for about $500 million. Other companies coming in, Majid Al Futtaim coming from the Emirates, putting in $1 billion into retail investment. The economy is growing, or would be based, the moment you have more stability, that you'd have even more investment. I think British Petroleum also has decided to put in about $1.5 billion extra investment into Egypt, because in the last few months there's a better program seen by outside investors particularly, and within Egypt there's some sense of stability. Well, once you have some element of stability at the top, and that comes from presidential elections and then parliamentary elections, which we expect in September, then you start a new round of political debate of when that will come. I think at the moment, by constantly trying to harass in whatever way that takes, I think we're getting away from what the problem is, because the people in the street are facing major issues, very few jobs, very high inflation. And you need a real good, solid program with the right people in place to take the right decisions with real goals to set the economy back on track.
Well, let's just pause at this particular point and take a look at the issue itself. Egypt has a long and growing list of economic problems it needs to deal with. Public debt is dangerously high at over 100% of GDP, while declining tourism and foreign investment have helped deplete its foreign currency reserves. And as we mentioned, government subsidies may no longer be sustainable, and they take up around a quarter of the budget. It's all leading to potentially explosive problems on the Egyptian streets. More than a quarter of the population lives under the poverty line of $2 a day. And unemployment, particularly in the young, is high and made worse because 700,000 young Egyptians enter the job market for the first time every year. Clearly, we see here, Tawfik Hamid, we see an economy that has got institutional problems within it. Angus Blair saying that it's done well over a period of time, or well considering. However, there do appear to be problems locked into that economy that are difficult for any government to approach.
Yeah, it's difficult for many governments to approach such problems, but it's inevitable necessity that we have to confront them in Egypt. So it's something you cannot avoid. I think the approach of General El-Sisi is wise here when he focused on relatively short-term solutions for problems. Like he focused on restructuring the subsidies, for example, because most of it actually goes to the wealthy and rich people. So just by taking a simple decision to restructure it in a way that it goes for the the poor people, then you can really start creating much difference on the street level, at the microeconomic level. So I see Sabahi promises, if you are comparing both, Sabahi promises 10,000 Egyptian pounds for each young man. This comes to around 300 billion pounds, which is something unthinkable when you think how he can get this money. Especially the Gulf countries will not be much a supporter of a man who holds the same views like Nasser, and similarly the West may be reluctant to support a man who clearly stated when in his first presidential race that he will or he would support the military struggle against or war against Israel. So you deal with a very complex situation, but General El-Sisi has support from both the Gulf countries with billions of dollars ready to put in, and from the West who now learned the lessons that stability is fundamental in Egypt. And I think both together, plus the short-term policy and plans, can help get the country out of this difficult situation.
Well, Abdul Dardery, I didn't give you an opportunity to respond to Angus Blair's criticism of the Freedom and Justice Party, the Muslim Brotherhood government, of which you were a part, with regard to its economic program. But firstly, when you were in government, did you encounter the problem of an economy that is embedded, encountering the problems that were left over from the Mubarak regime, for example? I'm getting to the question, are the economies linked to their past rather than to their present and future?
We cannot ignore the fact that the Egyptian economy is linked most to its past. And we in the government that was elected by, I disagree calling it the Muslim Brotherhood government, because it was a national unity government that the Muslim Brotherhood represented no more than 30% of the people in the government. We were struggling with the deep state. President Morsi or his government did not really fail, but they were made to fail by the military, the police, the judiciary, the deep state. All these were working against, even regional powers were working against President Morsi to succeed. The fact of the matter is that President Morsi was elected by the people of Egypt, and the people of Egypt wanted democracy to move forward. The problem in Egypt now is the military intervening in the democratic process. Please, for the sake of being honest to our listeners, let us not fool them and call it an election. Sisi will win. There is no doubt about it. Sisi knows it. Sabahi knows it. We, the Egyptian people, know it is not an election. It is a referendum. It is for the military to come back for its own, to protect its own economic interests. And that is the challenge. Stability, when every time I hear the word stability, I hear the word on the other side that echoes oppression. Oppression will never lead to economic reform, because economic reform requires liberalization. It requires freedom, all types of freedom. And without having these specific types of freedom, it's very difficult for the economic reform to take place. Sisi will not allow political, because he's bringing back the old Mubarak state, and the old Mubarak state was based on corruption. Corruption can never lead to efficiency, can never lead to a political reform. Look at 25% of young Egyptians are unemployed. And they want their freedom to be able. There is crony capitalism. There is a lot of corruption. And I really like the way you stated it. It is an institutional problem.
Well, Tawfik Hamid, I mean, there we've got a particular point of view once again, that you have, for example, what was mentioned a little bit earlier, for example, the vast resources of the military are kept out of public view. They are not part of the public accounting system, for example. These are issues that the new government would need to deal with, and the new president would need to deal with it.
Yeah, the government will know at the end the final report for how much the military budget is. So the final report, even in the US, not every detail in the military budget will be known to the government. There are certain things that need to be kept at secret level or classified level. But the details of the military spending, I think sometimes it's wise in a situation like what happened in Egypt to have some form of independence, not full independence, but separation between the military and the normal political system in the country when it comes to budget and control. I will give one example. When President Morsi came to power and millions of Egyptians went against him, more than 30 million people, more than those who went during Mubarak, against Mubarak. At that time, if the military was fully controlled by the president during Morsi time, he would have appointed some military leader from the Muslim Brotherhood. Then the outcome of the June 30 revolution would be useless, because if the head of the military is part of a specific organization or a group, then you will suppress any hope for revolutions or for people to express their opinions and the views against the presidents when he become tyrant. So I think we have very unique and special situation in Egypt that necessitates such position for the military. And I do see Egypt as Turkey 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when the military has some form of independence, not full, and gradually democracy came to the country in a gradual level. The sudden changes in societies to democracy sometimes can bring disasters, as what we have seen. But gradual transition of the population so that people learn how to respect the other, how to respect the views and opinions of the different people, how to accept democracy even at local scales within their jobs or their schools or the universities, then I think it can develop to full-scale democracy as we see in the West. But it's unfair to really ask Egypt to turn 180 degrees to be like the West, while the West itself took decades to reach that level of democracy.
Well, Angus Blair, I'd like to get your opinion on that. Is Egypt a special case that regards a special way of looking at it different from other countries?
No, I don't think it is, actually. All countries face similar problems at the levels of their social and economic change. There are different nuances, of course. I think there's a general issue about the whole region, actually, and putting it in context. The whole Middle East, North Africa faces from issues of transparency in governance everywhere, quite frankly, compared to other parts of the world. I've covered the region for 20 years. I thought there would have been far better progress in terms of general development and democratization, and especially in economic governance, which I have to say progress has been really quite poor. Right now, for example, in Lebanon, there's presidential elections due for the 25th of May. They're unlikely to happen. And the whole body politic there, for example, is not focusing on the economy. There are young people in Beirut, Zahli and Tripoli, tremendous trilingual talent that can't find jobs. But right now in Egypt, for example, as I've said, population growth is 2.6% per annum. And I mentioned already the number of key economic factors that are very difficult. You mentioned in terms of government debt, it's about 100% of GDP, but most of that actually is domestic debt. This isn't like the economic crisis in Egypt from 1999 to 2004, when the private sector and the government was heavily indebted in foreign currency. Egypt's actually in a pretty good situation compared to Southern Europe, for example, and unemployment levels are actually lower than they are in Southern Europe. But the structural issues are significant. There are water issues, for example, 98% of Egypt's water comes from outside its borders. Food, a mass of Egypt's food, a majority of Egypt's food comes from outside its borders, it's imported. So there are very many other issues that are important here. And I have to say the issue with regard to transparency and the military will happen, I'm sure, in time. But you have to look at these issues in terms of importance. First of all, you've got, as I mentioned, population growth of 2.6% per annum. People need jobs, they need housing, they need water, health, education and everything else. These are dramatic priorities for a country that's relatively poor compared to its neighbours elsewhere, particularly in the Gulf.
Well,
and the Gulf support, I think, will continue after the election.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Angus Blair, Tawfik Hamid and Abdul Dardery. And a reminder that Al Jazeera has been unable to report from Egypt this year. That's because our team there is in detention and has been since December the 29th. Peter Grester, Mohammed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed are falsely accused of providing a platform to the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. Abdullah Al-Shami from Al Jazeera's Arabic channel has been detained without trial since August and is currently on hunger strike. Al Jazeera rejects all charges against its staff and continues to demand their immediate release. And you can keep up to date with Al Jazeera's extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Egypt on air and online. Let us know your thoughts. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching. From me and all the team, goodbye for now.